Welcome to Talking About Watches with MrWatchMaster. I'm Andrew Cantor, co-founder and editor-in-chief of MrWatchMaster.com. In these podcasts, we're going to talk to amazing people in the watch world and discover some fascinating facts about them, their collections, and what they love about watches. In this episode, I speak with watch expert and journalist Ken Kessler, who's been involved with watches for 40 years as a collector and then as a dealer in vintage timepieces. He's written about watches for the Wall Street Journal, Revolution, GQ, Men's Health, Top Gear, Esquire, Financial Times, QP, The Telegraph, and over 100 other titles. I hope you enjoy our fascinating discussion about collecting, the watch industry, and Ken's thoughts on where it's heading in the future. Here's what he had to say.
I'm from the United States, but I've lived here since I first came here in 72, moved here permanently in 74. And I've been in the watch business since 79, initially as a dealer in vintage. And I've been writing about them since 1995. But I have two lives because my other career is high-end audio and reviewing music. So I have two strings to my bow, so to speak.
Excellent. So let's start by saying, where does your interest in watches originate from?
Well, the initial interest was seeing a friend's watch. We were 13, it was bar mitzvah time, and he got a fantastic Omega Constellation pie pan for his bar mitzvah, and it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. My family was from the other side of the tracks, so expensive watches were not in my history. Although I found out many years later, and I now own it, my father had a 1948 Longines, which I have since inherited. And so that is the family link. But it wasn't until the late 70s, for some reason, philosophically, I got obsessed with the passage of time. And something about it told me that time is so precious that it deserves to be marked with a fine timepiece. And people have to remember that wristwatches were not a prestige thing back then. Wristwatches were just a tool. So if you bought a Rolex, it's because you were a diver. If you bought a Patek, you were probably an executive or an aristocrat. And most people were quite blasé about their watches. On the collecting and antique side, it was strictly a world of pocket watches and clocks. So for me, I consider myself blessed that I got in on it in, say, 78, 79, 80, when it wasn't a thing. In fact, there were no magazines, and the only books that would appear a few years later with Schiffer Publishing in the States would start publishing things like the Rolex Guide. And I think it was around that time that the American collectors started coming out with the Cooksey and Shugart price guides. I think, and Dempsey in Texas. But again, this is early days. There was no watch community to speak of.
Sure. So, I mean, we can say you're a pioneer in that respect, but, there's obviously a lot been written about you. You've written a lot about it, but, can you tell us something we don't know about you?
Well, aside from the fact that my two worlds rarely collide, most of the hi-fi people are more of the hi-fi people are into watches than the other way around. So most people in the watch industry don't realize that my other life is completely separated from it, and it's been writing about hi-fi. But taking it away from my professional side, I can say, for example, that one of my real obsessions is Italian red wine.
Lovely.
Okay, but I don't feel qualified to write about it, because to me that's the stuff where you have to become a master of wine and be a sommelier.
Yeah.
And I don't consider my palate refined enough to be able to tell you which slope the grapes were grown on.
Fair enough.
My problem is that I have too many interests. And for example, I am obsessive about film noir. I collect hard-boiled detective fiction and fantasy novels. I've become obsessed reading biographies lately. For a long time, I was a collector of scale model cars because I'm obsessive about Bugatti, and I knew I would never own one. So, like a lot of car fanatics who are not in the in the financial zone where they can afford their dreams, they end up buying model cars.
Exactly. Yeah. I've been
I've
there
outgrown
myself.
that thing.
So look, you mentioned your father's Longines, which sounds amazing. But what was the first watch that you actually owned yourself?
Well, you see, I cannot remember prior to 79. I cannot remember any of the watches I wore except for a banged up old Seconda that I had through the 70s. Again, although I was aware of fine watches and always wanted one, it wasn't my first aspirational thing because, for example, I wanted to get a car or whatever. And
Sure.
also having emigrated when I was 20, while still a student, that was not a priority. The first serious watches I acquired, or say brands, it was again before there was a battle of quartz versus mechanical, and whereas mechanical came to dominate in the collector circle. So I would have had a couple of quartz watches. I know I certainly had a quartz Tissot, and I know that I had a quartz Omega before getting my first real watch, which was a Rolex Datejust.
Right. Okay.
And I got that one around 1980 or so.
Right.
I wish I still had it, but
that was my next question.
About 20 years ago, a friend of mine was desperate to get one for his father. So by that point, I had moved from dressy watches to sport watches, which we'll get onto.
Sure.
So I didn't mind parting with it, but it is one of those ones where we all have seller's remorse. And
yes, exactly.
I can think of, well, let's see, while I was buying and selling and trading watches, there must have been over 1,000 pieces through my hands. And that's before the internet.
Yeah.
But as far as watches that I let go, I also sold a few pieces for friends, and they were never, I was never going to be able to afford them. For example, I handled the sale of a 1940s steel Patek Calatrava.
Wow.
Which I will horrify you, and it went for $2,000.
Oh no.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Those kind of things. Well, if I'd had the money, I would have kept it.
Sure.
But I sold about, I think, 15 or 16 watches in auction 5 years ago to help pay bills. And out of those, the only ones I categorically regret letting go of were 3 Omega military watches, 2 military Lamanias, because my collecting has focused on 3 areas: military, chronographs, and diving watches. Those, I don't know. I don't know why. It's just never, dress watches have never really appealed to me.
Sure.
And I'm not even remotely interested in complications beyond dual time zone and chronograph and date.
Right. Interesting. So which watch do you wear now?
As a rule, I tend to wear watches, if I have them and I'm going to a press event, I tend to wear the watch of the brand I'm going to.
Sure.
Because of the politics and the sensitivities in the watch industry. For example, I would never wear a Rolex to an Omega event. I would never wear a Patek to a Vacheron event.
Yeah.
But out of the 100 watches I own, I probably represent about 60 brands. So for example, if I'm going to a Hamilton event, I will wear a Hamilton. If I'm going to a Longines event, I will wear a Longines. Sure. Yeah. Today, I'm wearing a Peter Roberts Concentrique, which is probably the rarest watch in my collection. Yeah. But Peter's a personal friend, which is why I acquired it.
Okay.
And as I say, I tend to wear the watch for the occasion.
Exactly. So let's think about, you say you've got about 100 watches, but which watch that you don't own would you like to own?
Well, it's funnily enough, this just came up. Watch Pro has been asking various journalists what their 10 favorite watches would be if they won the lottery. And I made a point of 2 things. One, none of the watches in the list do I own. And number 2, none of the watches are really current. Because I hate the aggravating politics of being a watch journalist. If I'd have listed 10 current watches, there's 590 brands that didn't get a name check. So the one watch that I used to dream about and still do, but they're now crazy money, is a Patek Philippe reference 1463, which is a dress chronograph. That is my absolute dream watch.
Mm.
And my bucket list watches that I never acquired because they were always slightly dearer than I could afford were an original Breguet Type 20, let's say 1950s, 1960s, preferably the 3 subdial. And I wouldn't have minded a first generation Blancpain 50 Fathoms. I'm lucky in that I've got the milestone, not the milestone, but the iconic Rolexes I had over the years, Explorer 1 and Explorer 2, Air King, Submariner, things like that. But with all of them, you can just keep on going, and eventually you find yourself like me with 100 watches, and then you end up needing to dispose of them. But fortunately, my son is also in the watch industry.
Yes, indeed.
I don't have to worry about where they will end up.
Absolutely. Oh, that's marvelous. So we talked a little bit about the watch industry, the watch business. Obviously, you go to lots of events, you meet lots of people from the industry. But so, what do you like best about the watch business?
Well, because I've been in it for so long and I've watched it change. Well, everything changes over 4 or 5 decades, of course, but I don't think it's changed for the better in many ways. On the upside, what I love about the watch industry is that it's healthy. And to say something like that at this time, when you have, for example, the automotive industry is in deep trouble because of supply of IC chips. The hi-fi industry, which is close to my heart, is in trouble because post-millennials don't care about sound quality, let alone physical media. They don't want whatever anyone thinks about the vinyl revival. They don't really want libraries. They just want to stream. So most industries, circa 2022, that is, because of the current financial climate, are really struggling. Travel industry, hospitality. The one that seems to have defied it is the watch industry. And all you need to prove that is just ask someone how long it takes to get a Rolex or a Patek. Now, the rest of the watch industry has benefited from that because I personally know people that either don't qualify or don't want to put up with the shenanigans of waiting 3-4 years for a watch. So they then move on to another brand. So in each case, Rolex is probably unique in that people want a Rolex and nothing else. Patek Philippe, which is to me probably the greatest of all the brands, if you cannot get say a Nautilus, you might then consider a Royal Oak, or vice versa. If you cannot get a particular Calatrava, you might consider a Vacheron. They've been rivals for 100 years plus. So in that respect, when I consider that the audio industry is shrinking, that the economy has gone down the toilet, the prices have gone through the roof, the one thing that seems to be solid at the moment is the watch industry. And I don't know how many people appreciate that are within the watch industry.
Yeah. I mean, is there an argument to say that people are looking at it as like an alternative investment side of things, or because I think as you say,
your next question.
Well, it does really,
the distasteful side. You see, I'm in the although I'm a watch journalist and make a little bit of my income from watches, I'm in the privileged position of being old enough to not care about investing because investing takes time. The purist in me, and this applies to other things like I used to collect cameras, and as an example of the abuse of one of my passions is I think of these idiots who buy Leica cameras and never open the box because they don't want it to depreciate. So my attitude has been never buy anything that you're not planning to use. There are legendary myths about mythical stories or legends. I don't want to be tautological there, where wealthy people have bought cars and just put them away, never driven them. I know a couple of these for fact rather than urban myths. I know so many watch collectors that have watches that have never been taken out of their boxes. Now, I get this because investing in the stock market is volatile. Investing in real estate is boring. So if you are going to if you do want to invest in something that gets your juices flowing, well, why not? So, for example, taking it away from watches for a minute, if you're a music fanatic, you would invest in rare vinyl. I know, jumping to the 21st century, there are people investing in trainers. I don't get that at all.
Yeah.
These are shoes. I don't get that at all.
Yeah.
Whereas watches combine technology and art and jewelry and luxury. In that respect, they tick more boxes than most other fields. But I am tired of hearing from watch so-called enthusiasts who really aren't into watches at all. They're just looking for another page in their portfolio. And I think, you know what? Just go buy some shares. Go play with cyber currency or something. I don't want to know. Because I grew up in this industry in a period where the CEOs were watchmakers. They weren't just some executive with a degree in economics from some Swiss university.
Yeah.
And that's part of what has changed. And also, if you look online, to my shame, I look at Instagram and I see these wheeler dealer types. It's gone from the genteel, intelligent watch enthusiasts, for example, Somlo and Duggan and the Watch Club. You go online and you see these guys that are doubles for Grant Mitchell off of EastEnders, these thugs with 42 Royal Oaks in front of them. And I just find that nauseating. They're like lower on the food chain than used car dealers selling chop jobs. So but a colleague of mine from the audio industry who is a big watch enthusiast, and he's in the extreme high end of both watches and hi-fi. He said, when the money increases, the reptiles come out from under the rocks. And unfortunately, there are a lot of reptiles in the watch business. Well, I mean, it is after all Swiss.
Exactly. So do you think that trend will continue? Do you think the watch industry will continue on its upward trajectory in terms of?
Oh, yes, on every level. My main interest is vintage. For a number of reasons. I don't want to disrespect any of the modern watches, but the ones that I admire are way beyond my means, and I am of an age where I'm not buying anymore. But for example, if I was suddenly 20 years younger and 10 times wealthier, I would be begging to get a Roger Smith, a Philippe Dufour, a Day Bethune, a Royal Forcy. There are loads of phenomenal watches. As I say, I'm not crazy about complications, but that's another side of it. But I don't see anything slowing down the growth, especially on the vintage side and on the Rolex stroke Patek side, because as people discover watches, it's like with real estate, they say God isn't making any more land. Well, aside from fakes, God isn't making any more Paul Newmans. So those will only appreciate. The waiting lists, even when Rolex opens up its new factory, it's like when they add a lane to a motorway.
It fills up.
It'll fill up. So I will never discourage anyone from buying watches to invest if they ask me that straightforward as a straightforward question. Well, what I will say to them is that they're a bit too late on the vintage side in particular, because the prices have already reached like supercars in the 90s. You're not going to get enough of a deal if you're looking to invest, unless you're in the position to wait for 8 or 10 years.
Exactly. So if someone was looking to start a watch collection, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
I would say don't look at the usual suspects.
Right.
There are at least 200 or 300 historical brands, some of which are still around, that have reputations and pedigrees as good as Rolex, Patek, Vacheron, Audemars, the usual suspects. The usual suspects are priced out of beyond the reach of most normal people. And if you had, say, under £1,000 or even under £500, I would say, look at any steel Hamilton, steel Longines, steel Certina, steel Doxa. And then the next level up that's still just about affordable, the simpler Breitlings, the simpler Hoyers. You can go on and on and on, but it's nauseating in the repetition of Patek Rolex, Patek Rolex, Patek Rolex. I get it. I get it. These are brilliant brands, but it's now like vintage Ferraris. Even the dull ones. I remember when there were Italian supercars.
Is there a dull Ferrari?
Well, things like there was the mid-engine one from there was one from the 60s, that was a wedge-shaped thing, or 70s. That a 308 or something.
308, yeah.
And you couldn't give them away. Now
Oh
You'd be
yeah,
lucky to get one for 40K.
really.
And that's what happened. I remember with things like Bizzarinis and Isobrifos and De Tomasos. No one wanted them.
Mm,
You look at the price now of these things, and they're six figures and above, simply because the number of people who want them, it's classic supply and demand,
Yep.
the number of people who want them, and the increase in the number of people with huge amounts of disposable income has blessedly increased for those fields. Yes, there's still poverty. I don't want this to become a woke problem, but
Exactly.
we're talking about the luxury sector.
Exactly.
And to deny that people have
fair.
money, but more to the point, to deny that they should be allowed to spend it any way they want, I find horrific.
True.
So if someone wants to drop 85 million on a Ferrari 250 GTO, or for that matter, 400K on a Patek, on a Rolex Paul Newman, that's their business.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So listen, as we come to the end, what's next on the horizon for you? What were you looking forward to for the next sort of 12 months or so?
Well, I just want to get through the next 12 months because, like everyone else, the financial situation, we're all struggling. I've turned my thermostat down by 1.5 degrees. I really am in like a lot of people on cruise control at the moment. I don't sticking with watches. I don't anticipate any great changes in the watch business because, as we said before, both vintage and high end are still on the ascent. Yes, there have been recent reports, and by recent I mean within the last 2 months since the autumn, that prices are dropping for people who are flipping watches.
Yeah.
So, for example, the colored dial Rolexes, the standard Aquanauts and Nautiluses, as opposed to the, say, a Tiffany. I've been told that those are dropping, but there are still money to be made for the people that are the opportunists. Back to something we said earlier, it's still a situation of there's no point buying a watch for flipping if there's no margin to be made. In other words, if you're going to buy an Aquanaut to flip it, you have to be able to get one at retail. Yeah. And that means getting back on the waiting list. As far as the new watches go, I haven't really spotted any trends, but then Watches and Wonders is 3 or 4 months away. I think the colored dials thing is no longer a trend. I think it's a standard. I think all the brands have realized how much potential there is. A classic example is one of my favorite brands, Doxa. One of the smartest things they did to raise awareness was to bring out their classic diving watches with a variety of dials. As we know, the Rolexes that came out in yellow, green, they were gone on announcement.
Exactly, yeah.
As far as complications go, they're all out there. Urwerk and companies like that still bring out novel items to attract.
They've been quite quiet though, haven't they? I haven't really seen a lot from them recently.
Well, there were a couple of watches this past year that were variations on their themes.
Yeah.
But I suppose that with all of the what I call the auteur brands, the ones that include all of the, from Global Forsey to David Tune to Roger Smith, all of these and even up to and including Journe and Richard Mille, which have produced in much larger numbers.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing after about 25, 30 years of this phenomenon, which started in, say, the late 80s, early 90s with Frank Muller and Daniel Roth. These brands have now been around long enough to have collectors that only buy their watches or focus on them. For example, I know guys that are obsessed with Kari Voutilainen. Yeah. And they have 4 or 5 of those. I know another guy who's crazy about Chapek. So that is one of the trend. I don't like using the word trend, but that is one of the paths, or that is one of the niches that will continue to develop in collecting. As far as the vintage size goes, well, the way we've said before, God isn't making any more Paul Newmans. Yeah. So I think that the vintage remains on the vertical trajectory.
Sure. Fascinating. Well, Ken, unless you have any questions for me, that's about it. But it's been an absolute pleasure.
Unfortunately, that wasn't on the preliminary letter. But
Thank you for listening to Talking About Watches with Mr. Watchmaster. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. For more information and great stories about watches and the people behind them, please visit www.mrwatchmaster.com. I look forward to hearing from you soon and hope you enjoy the next podcast which is coming up.